Have you ever noticed how the loudest people in a corporate office hide the biggest secrets? They throw around buzzwords to cover up a $10 million grift right under everyone's noses. They thought because I sat quietly in the back, staring at compliance spreadsheets, I wouldn't notice when the numbers started bleeding. They were wrong. And when they finally fired me, they just handed me the match. Welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in. Unfortunately, YouTube recently disabled our monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can pay their living expenses and continue bringing you great content. You can easily donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description and pinned comment. My name is Everly Gonzalez. I am 34 years old, and until recently, I was a data quality analyst at Aegis Tech Biomedical in Austin, Texas. In the modern corporate ecosystem, my job was the equivalent of being the ghost in the machine. I sat in a windowless corner of the fourth floor, bathed in the pale blue glow of dual monitors, sifting through endless rows of compliance data, while the rest of the company celebrated wins I never got invited to. The air inside the Aegis Tech building always felt artificially chilled, heavy with the relentless hum of servers and the silent desperation of people trying to climb a ladder that was missing half its rungs. My role was entirely invisible to the executives upstairs, yet absolutely critical. I was the person who ensured that our medical device software met stringent federal regulations before anyone tried to roll it out to the public. Without my final sign-off, nothing legally moved forward, or at least, that was how it was supposed to work. We were on the absolute verge of securing a $10 million government contract with the Department of Veterans Affairs. The product was pitched as a revolutionary real-time cardiac monitoring system designed to protect the lives of military veterans. The stakes were incredibly high. $10 million is exactly the kind of money that makes a company stop caring about ethics and start worshiping timelines. The pressure trickled down from the boardroom like a slow poison, infecting every department. That is when Marcus Vance arrived. He was the newly hired vice president of strategic initiatives. Marcus was excessively charismatic, the kind of guy who wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than my monthly rent and smiled with all his teeth but absolutely none of his eyes. He spoke in aggressive corporate buzzwords like synergy and agile deployment, treating federal healthcare regulations not as vital safety measures, but as annoying speed bumps on his personal highway to a massive year-end bonus. To Marcus, compliance was just a suggestion, a bureaucratic hurdle to be outsmarted rather than respected. I usually let the executive posturing slide right past me. My job was data, not office politics, but then I spotted the first subtle red flag. I was running a routine audit late on a Tuesday afternoon on a batch of clinical trial data sent over from a third-party testing facility called Apex Analytics. As I scrolled through the heart rate logs on my secondary monitor, the numbers felt too clean. I pulled up the raw data tables and ran a variance analysis. The timestamp intervals were perfectly sequenced. Every single beat, every microsecond of the cardiac rhythm, aligned flawlessly on a mathematical grid. Real human heart rates do not look like that. Real human hearts flutter. They skip. They race. When you drink too much caffeine or think about a stressful email, they are inherently erratic. The data I was looking at was entirely algorithmically generated. Someone had written a sophisticated script to fake a flawless clinical trial. Assuming it was just a strange software glitch from the testing facility, I followed standard protocol. I flagged the anomaly in the main compliance system, attaching a brief, technical note explaining the artificial variance, and pushed it up the chain for review. I took a sip of my water, expecting to hear back from the engineering team the next morning. Instead, exactly 20 minutes later, my system pinged with a harsh notification sound. The flag had been cleared. It was not investigated, not passed to an engineer, and definitely not resolved. It was manually overridden by an executive-level account. A cold muss, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Later that afternoon, I walked into the staff break room to grab a coffee and found Marcus leaning casually against the espresso machine, checking his phone. I decided to bring it up directly, testing the waters to see if he was aware of the override. "Hey, Marcus," I said, keeping my tone light and conversational. "I noticed someone overrode the anomaly flag on the Apex Analytics batch this morning. Those timestamp intervals look entirely synthetic. I think we need to run a deeper diagnostic before we even think about submitting the packet to the VA." Marcus did not blink. He slipped his phone into his pocket and offered me one of those hollow, magazine cover smiles. "Everly, right?" he asked, though I knew he knew exactly who I was. "Listen, I looked at that flag. It is just legacy data formatting from the older monitors Apex uses. The migration software always straightens out the timestamps when it imports to our system. It is totally fine. But the intervals are mathematically perfect." I pushed back gently, maintaining my professional composure. "That implies the raw diagnostic data itself is missing. The VA will run their own algorithms on this. If they see perfectly spaced beats, they will fail the entire product." His smile tightened, the edges of it growing sharp and cold. He took a single step closer, invading my personal space just enough to make the power dynamics suffocatingly clear. "We are closing in on a massive win for this company. Everly, we have a very tight, inflexible timeline for Q3. What we do not need is someone from the basement derailing this entire operation with unnecessary research. The data is fine. Leave it alone." He turned and walked out of the break room without waiting for a response, leaving me standing there with a lukewarm coffee and a terrifying realization. It was not a glitch. It was not a formatting error. It was a feature of the fraud, and I was looking right at it. Marcus telling me to drop the investigation did not extinguish my suspicion. It poured premium gasoline all over it. The moment I returned to my desk after our break room encounter, I closed every open spreadsheet on my monitors and took a deep, steadying breath. I knew exactly how corporate cover-ups operated. The first rule was always to silence the lowest person on the totem pole. I decided right then that I was going to be completely silent, but I was absolutely not going to stop digging. I immediately created a new, heavily encrypted folder on the deepest partition of my local hard drive. I named it Project Icarus. If Marcus and the executive team were flying too close to the sun, I was going to document every single feather burning off their wings. For the next 2 weeks, my routine shifted into a paranoid, nocturnal grind. During the day, I performed my standard, tedious tasks. I nodded during staff meetings, smiled politely at the water cooler, and played the part of the obedient, invisible data analyst perfectly. But when the clock struck 6 in the evening and the office slowly emptied out, the real work began. The fluorescent lights overhead would dim to half capacity, casting long, harsh shadows across the gray cubicles. The silence of the empty floor was deafening, broken only by the frantic clicking of my mouse and the steady, rhythmic tapping of my keyboard. My very first target was Apex Analytics. If the clinical data they provided was completely fabricated, I needed to know who was generating it. I logged into state business registries, bypassing the basic public search functions and utilizing the advanced corporate tracking databases I had access to for compliance verification. I pulled their tax identification records, their incorporation documents, and their registered agent history. It took me 4 solid hours of tracing dead links and convoluted corporate ownership trees to find the truth. Apex Analytics was not a state-of-the-art biomedical testing facility. It did not have sterile laboratories, brilliant scientists, or human test subjects. It was an absolute ghost. The company was nothing more than a shell entity, registered to a lonely post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the Delaware registration document glowing on my screen. This was no longer just a case of cut corners or aggressive corporate timelines. Aegis Tech was intentionally fabricating the safety metrics of a life-or-death medical device. They were fully prepared to strap cardiac monitors containing untested, fatally flawed software onto the chests of military veterans. They were willing to risk the lives of people who had served our country, all to secure a $10 million payout from the federal government. The sheer, sociopathic greed of it made my hands shake. I had to grip the cold, hard edge of my desk just to ground myself. But a fake company needs real funding to look legitimate on paper. I pivoted my investigation to the accounting servers, meticulously tracking the advance payments we had already received from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was a labyrinth of digital ledgers, but data always leaves a trail if you know exactly where to look. I found a recurring sequence of outbound wire transfers buried deep in the quarterly expense reports. They were vaguely labeled as external consulting fees and expedited testing retainers. I traced the routing numbers through a maze of banking protocols. The money was bleeding out of the government advance, funneling through the Delaware Shell Company, and quietly depositing into an offshore banking account located in the Cayman Islands. It was a classic, textbook kickback scheme, and the primary signatory on the offshore account? A holding trust directly tied to Marcus Vance. He was not just pushing a dangerously defective product, he was personally siphoning off the taxpayer money funding it. I frantically took screenshots, saving every single ledger, every routing number, and every fake invoice directly into Project Icarus. My heart hammered against my ribs, sounding incredibly loud in the empty office space. I was entirely alone, unearthing a federal crime of massive, terrifying proportions. Then, the digital walls started closing in. On a Thursday morning, I tried to log into the central compliance server to pull the historical error reports for the cardiac monitors. A stark, red access denied message flashed across my screen. I tried my secondary login, denied again. A company-wide email pinged into my inbox minutes later. It was from Marcus, announcing a sudden departmental restructuring of our network security protocols to ensure maximum efficiency ahead of the government launch. My administrative privileges had been completely revoked. I was locked out of the very system I was hired to monitor. He was trying to blind me. He knew I had access to the raw data, and he was sealing the vault before I could look inside again. Panic flared, hot and sharp, but I forced it down. Marcus was arrogant, but he severely underestimated me. He assumed I only used the standard front door access protocols given to regular employees. He did not know that 3 years ago, during a massive information technology migration project. I had been tasked with building the archival bridges between our old servers and the new cloud infrastructure. I had created a backdoor administrative credential to streamline the massive data transfer, and I had simply never deleted it. That night, I waited in my cubicle until exactly 8:30. The cleaning crew had already finished vacuuming my floor and moved down to the lobby. "Good night, Everly. Do not work too late," the head custodian had told me as he rolled his cart onto the elevator. "I will try not to," I had replied with a tight smile. Now, the office was pitch black outside the glow of my dual monitors. My hands trembled slightly as I opened a secure command terminal and typed in the old, forgotten credential string. The system paused for agonizing. Endless seconds. The green cursor blinked rhythmically. Access granted. I was in. I bypassed the restricted user interface and dove straight into the raw back-end database. I did not have much time before automated security sweeps might flag the unusual backdoor entry. I searched frantically for the original, unedited clinical trial failure logs. This was the real data that existed before Marcus and his Delaware ghost company scrubbed it flawlessly clean. I found them hidden away in an obscure, supposedly deleted partition. The failure rates were absolutely catastrophic. The devices were missing critical cardiac events, shutting down randomly during stress tests, and transmitting false positives that would trigger unnecessary medical interventions. It was a digital graveyard of broken code and potential casualties. I immediately initiated a mass download, pulling everything directly into Project Icarus. The progress bar crawled across my screen with agonizing slowness. 10%, 30%, 60%. Every single creak of the settling building sounded like approaching footsteps. Every hum of the air conditioning unit felt like a security alarm about to trigger. I kept my eyes darting frantically between the painfully slow download bar and the reflection of the glass office door behind me. At exactly 9 o'clock, the download completed with a soft chime. I safely ejected my encrypted drive, meticulously wiped my digital footprints from the command terminal, and logged out of the back door. When I arrived at work the very next morning, the central database was entirely offline for an unscheduled emergency maintenance block. By the time the servers came back up at 12 noon, the partition containing the original failure logs had been completely and permanently wiped from existence. Marcus had burned the evidence to the ground, but he was exactly 12 hours too late. I had every single digital ash safely stored in my pocket, ready to start a fire of my own. I wanted to do things the right way. Despite everything I had uncovered, a naive part of me still believed in the system. I thought Aegis Tech as a whole was not corrupt, just a few bad apples at the top. The company handbook heavily promoted our third-party secure ethics hotline, a portal supposedly managed by an independent oversight firm guaranteed to protect whistleblowers. Late on a Wednesday night, sitting at my kitchen table, I drafted a meticulous, heavily redacted tip. I did not include my name, my department, or any raw files. I simply outlined the structural anomalies in the third-party clinical testing and suggested a full federal compliance audit. I routed my connection through a secure virtual private network, connected to the wireless internet of a coffee shop 3 miles from my apartment, and hit submit. A little green checkmark appeared, assuring me my anonymity was absolutely safe. I had never been more wrong in my entire life. The illusion of safety shattered less than 24 hours later. At exactly 2 o'clock the next afternoon, a sudden, mandatory calendar invite popped up on my screen. It was titled simply, Alignment Meeting, sent directly from Naomi. Naomi was our Director of Human Resources. She was a woman who navigated the corporate waters with the cold, precise efficiency of a great white shark. She wore sharp, monochromatic suits and possessed an uncanny ability to terminate employees while making them feel like they owed the company an apology. When I walked into the glass-walled conference room, my stomach dropped. Naomi was seated at the head of the long oak table, her hands folded neatly over a pristine legal pad, and sitting right next to her, slouched in his chair with a sickeningly casual posture, was Marcus. "Everly, please, take a seat," Naomi said. Her voice was smooth, carrying the manufactured warmth of a customer service recording. "Close the door behind you." I sat down across from them, folding my hands in my lap, so they would not see my fingers shaking. "We called you in because we have noticed some shifts in your departmental output lately," Naomi began, tilting her head with feigned concern. "We value our data analysts immensely, but Marcus mentioned you have been asking a lot of questions about timelines and legacy formats. Tell me, Everly, how are your stress levels holding up?" "My stress levels are perfectly fine," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I am just committed to ensuring our final product launch goes smoothly." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The fluorescent lights overhead caught the predatory gleam in his eyes. "It is admirable, really," Marcus said softly. "But sometimes, people under immense stress start seeing things that are not there. They start looking for anomalies, for conspiracies. They might even try to reach out to external parties to validate their paranoia." A sharp chill ran down my spine. Naomi picked up a sleek silver pen and tapped it against her notepad. "We take data security very seriously here, Everly. In fact, our internal monitoring systems are incredibly robust. We even track the network addresses of all incoming traffic. For example, did you know that someone pinged our internal servers last night from a public network? A little coffee shop over on West 5th Street. I believe my lungs stopped working. The coffee shop. The exact location I had used to mask my connection when I submitted the anonymous tip." Marcus smiled, showing all those perfectly white, dead teeth. "It is a dangerous world out there, Everly. Proprietary data is the lifeblood of this company. If a disgruntled employee, say, hypothetically, downloaded sensitive files and attempted to leak them, that would not just be a fireable offense. That would trigger immediate corporate espionage charges. We would be forced to involve the authorities. A person could face decades in federal prison, their entire life, their future, completely ruined over a simple misunderstanding. The trap snapped shut around me with terrifying clarity. The ethics hotline was not managed by a third party. It was a complete sham, a digital honey trap that routed directly to Naomi's personal inbox. And Naomi was not just protecting the company. The way she looked at Marcus, the subtle shift of her shoulder toward his, the shared, knowing smirk. They were in this together. They were romantically and financially entangled, guarding their $10 million payday. There was no human resources department to protect me. There was no safe harbor. I was locked in a soundproof room with the two people who were actively orchestrating a massive fraud. And they were telling me, straight to my face, that they knew exactly what I was doing. If I showed defiance right now, they would fire me on the spot, seize my equipment, and tie me up in so much litigation I would never see the light of day. I had to pivot. I had to give them exactly what they wanted to see. I had to become the hysterical, broken woman they assumed I was. I let my shoulders collapse. I forced my breathing to turn shallow and ragged. I brought a hand up to my face, letting my voice crack perfectly. "I am so sorry," I whispered, letting a single tear spill over my eyelashes. "You are right. You are completely right. I have not been sleeping. The screen time, the endless spreadsheets, it is just getting to me. I thought I saw errors, but I think my eyes are just exhausted. I have been so terrified of making a mistake that I started second-guessing everything. Please, I need this job. I am just so overworked." I looked at Naomi, widening my eyes in desperate plea. "Please do not let me go. I will take a few days off. I will clear my head. I promise I will not ask any more questions. Just give me a second chance." The silence in the room stretched out, thick and heavy. Naomi glanced at Marcus. Marcus looked at me, his expression morphing from suspicion to a deep, satisfying contempt. He bought it. He loved seeing me break. He loved the power. "Take the rest of the day, Everly," Naomi said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Go home. Rest. We will regroup and evaluate your position moving forward. Do not log into the network tonight." I nodded frantically, wiping my face, and practically stumbled out of the conference room. I kept up the charade all the way to my car, my head bowed in defeat. But the moment I closed the car door and the lock clicked into place, the tears vanished instantly. My face went completely cold. My heart beat with a steady, lethal rhythm. They thought they had neutralized me. They thought they had terrified me into submission. They did not realize that by confirming they knew about the coffee shop, they had given me the final piece of the puzzle. They were coming for me, and my time at Aegis Tech was over. That night, sitting in the darkness of my apartment, I opened up my personal laptop. I could not rely on the government hotline, and I could not rely on the company. I was entirely on my own. I opened a coding terminal and began to type. I spent 6 hours building a digital dead man's switch. It was a highly sophisticated, self-executing script tied directly to my employee login credentials. I attached the massive, fully decrypted dossier containing every single piece of evidence I had gathered. I programmed the destination addresses carefully: the Food and Drug Administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. I set the countdown timer. If I did not manually log into the Aegis Tech company server by exactly 5 o'clock the very next day to reset the timer, the script would bypass all local firewalls and blast the unredacted files directly to the federal agencies. I was no longer just a data analyst. I was a ticking time bomb, and the clock had officially started. Corporate America has a highly specific, clinical choreography for executions. They always do it on a Friday. They wait until the final hours of the work week, minimizing the chance of an office scene and giving the terminated employee the weekend to disappear into the void. At exactly 4:45 in the afternoon, my inbox produced a sharp, solitary ping. A new calendar invite had materialized. The subject line was blank, but the location was listed simply as Mandatory Sync, Human Resources Room A. I did not pack my bag. I did not log out of my workstation. I simply stood up and walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the administrative wing. The air conditioning hummed, cold and indifferent. When I pushed open the heavy glass door to Room A, the firing squad was already in position. Naomi sat rigidly at the center of the polished mahogany table, a thick manila envelope resting perfectly square in front of her. Marcus stood by the window, his arms crossed over his chest, exuding a suffocating aura of triumph. In the corner of the room stood a burly security guard wearing a cheap suit and an uncomfortable scowl. The presence of the guard was a calculated intimidation tactic designed to make me feel small, dangerous, and utterly powerless. "Have a seat, Everly," Naomi instructed. Her voice was flat, devoid of the theatrical empathy she had weaponized the day before. The charade was over. I pulled out a chair and sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at her. "Effective immediately. Your employment at Aegis Tech Biomedical is terminated," Naomi recited, reading from a prepared legal script. "This decision is final. You are being dismissed with cause. Specifically, our systems have flagged a severe breach of company policy regarding unauthorized research and the gross violation of internal data protocols." Marcus stepped away from the window and sauntered over to the table. He picked up the manila envelope, pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers, and slid it aggressively across the polished wood until it hit my folded hands. He tossed a heavy metallic pen right on top of it. "Here is the reality of your situation," Marcus said, leaning over the table so his face was only a few feet from mine. "That packet contains your termination paperwork and a standard, airtight, non-disclosure agreement. If you sign it right now, the company has generously agreed to grant you 2 weeks of severance pay. We will code your departure as a mutual separation, and you can quietly move on with your life." I stared at the paperwork. I did not touch the pen. "And if I do not sign it?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Marcus let out a short, hollow laugh. "Austin is a very small tech town. Everly, the executive networks talk to each other. If you refuse to sign, we will terminate you for gross misconduct. I will personally ensure that every recruiter in the state of Texas knows you are a security risk. You will never touch compliance data in this industry again. You can take the 2 weeks of pay and keep your mouth shut, or you can walk out of here with absolutely nothing and watch your career burn to the ground. The choice is yours." He waited for the tears. He waited for the same frantic, broken woman he had seen in the conference room 24 hours earlier. He expected me to beg, to panic, or to violently defend my innocence. Instead, I looked at the NDA, then slowly looked up, meeting Marcus dead in the eye. I did not blink. The silence in the room stretched until it became incredibly heavy, practically suffocating them. I reached out, picked up the silver pen, and deliberately placed it back on Naomi's side of the table. I pushed the unsigned severance packet right next to it. "I politely decline your severance," I said calmly. I reached up to my collar, unclipped my corporate identification badge, and dropped it onto the glass surface. It landed with a sharp, definitive clatter. Without waiting for permission or a dismissal, I stood up and pushed my chair back. Naomi looked genuinely startled, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. The security guard stepped forward, gesturing heavily toward the door. As I walked past Marcus, he leaned against the doorframe, unable to let me leave without throwing one last punch. "Have a nice life, Everly," he mocked, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance. "Do not feel too bad. Some people are just meant to be followers." I did not look back. I followed the guard through the silent, staring office, stepped into the elevator, and walked out through the lobby doors. The late afternoon Texas heat hit me like a physical wall, thick and blazing hot. I walked to my car, started the engine, and drove away from the pristine corporate campus. I rolled the windows down, letting the hot wind tear through my hair. I did not drive home. Instead, I pulled into the empty parking lot of a rundown diner on the edge of the highway. I walked inside, sat down at a sticky vinyl booth, and ordered a black coffee from a tired waitress. I placed my phone on the table face up. The digital clock on the screen read 4:58. I took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. 4:59. I watched the second hand tick away in my mind. The Aegis Tech servers were waiting for my login. They were waiting for me to authenticate my presence, to prove I was still a compliant, controlled employee. 5 o'clock. I sat perfectly still, listening to the hum of the diner's ceiling fan. At exactly 5:01 in the evening, my phone screen remained dark, but I felt the shift in the universe. My dead man's switch activated, far away, operating on a hidden cloud server. My self-executing script bypassed every single Aegis Tech firewall. The massive, 400-page encrypted dossier containing the fake Delaware registries, the Cayman Island offshore accounts, the real clinical failure logs, and the internal tracking of the hotline trap fired into the digital ether. It landed simultaneously in the priority inbox of the Food and Drug Administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. Marcus thought he had stripped me of my power. He did not know I had just pulled the pin on a grenade and casually tossed it into his boardroom. Monday morning at Aegis Tech Biomedical began exactly like every other Monday. The expensive espresso machines hissed in the break rooms. The marketing team gathered for their morning stand-up meetings to discuss synergy, and the executives settled comfortably into their plush leather chairs on the top floor. The building was a fortress of corporate arrogance, but at exactly 9:15 in the morning, the illusion of untouchability completely and violently shattered. A coordinated fleet of 8 black, unmarked sport utility vehicles aggressively hopped the curb, ignoring the pristine landscaping, and formed a tight blockade across the main entrance of the Austin campus. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Food and Drug Administration poured out of the vehicles. They swarmed through the revolving glass doors with terrifying synchronized precision. They did not stop at the reception desk to sign in. They instantly fanned out across the massive lobby, physically locking down the elevator banks and immediately severing all external network access for the entire building. The wireless internet died. The landlines went completely dead. The corporate fortress was successfully sealed. I was not there to see the panic in person. I was sitting comfortably on my living room sofa, drinking a warm cup of herbal tea, watching the beautiful chaos unfold in real time through a frantic, exploding group chat on my personal phone. My former coworkers were sending a relentless barrage of terrified, confused, and exhilarated messages. One data analyst described the exact moment the elevator doors dinged open on the restricted executive floor. A tactical squad of agents marched straight past the stunned administrative assistants and kicked open the heavy oak door to the vice president's office. Marcus was reportedly in the middle of a high-level video conference call. According to a rapid-fire message from the senior compliance coordinator, all the arrogant color instantly drained from Marcus's face, leaving him looking sickly and ghostly pale. He frantically reached for his keyboard, attempting to lock his screen or trigger a remote wipe. But a federal agent physically pulled his ergonomic chair away from the desk. The agent confiscated his sleek corporate laptop and forcefully seized his personal cell phone straight out of his sweating hand. The charismatic leader who had mocked me on Friday was completely neutralized in under 30 seconds. By 12 noon, the localized corporate raid had rapidly mutated into a national catastrophe. I turned on my television and watched the major financial news networks abruptly break into their regular daytime programming. A severe, unsmiling anchor announced breaking news that the Department of Veterans Affairs was officially and immediately suspending the pending $10 million contract with Aegis Tech. The anchor read from a federal press release citing a massive criminal investigation into deeply fraudulent data algorithms and severe safety violations that threatened the lives of military veterans. The reaction from the Wall Street trading floors was instantaneous and utterly brutal. I watched the live stock ticker running across the bottom of the television screen as the company valuation plummeted into the abyss. Investors hit the panic button. In less than 45 minutes, Aegis Tech's stock price went into a catastrophic 60% nosedive. The red arrows flashed violently, wiping out hundreds of millions of dollars in market capitalization until the automated circuit breakers finally tripped, forcibly halting all trading for the company. The financial lifeblood of the corporation was entirely cut off while the whole country watched. The implosion heavily accelerated when the press got hold of the digital wreckage. Anonymous sources, fueled by the massive dossier the federal agencies had immediately cross-referenced with the seized internal servers, began leaking sensitive internal communications to major investigative journalists. The most damning revelations broadcasted that afternoon centered entirely around the Human Resources Department. Leading news outlets published full transcripts of Naomi's frantic, time-stamped emails sent during the first minutes of the raid. She had desperately tried to command the Information Technology Department to permanently scrub the fake whistleblower hotline logs and completely wipe the specific inbox that had trapped my Internet Protocol address. It was absolute, undeniably documented proof of premeditated retaliation against a whistleblower. Her meticulous, cold corporate armor was completely destroyed on national television, exposing her as a desperate criminal attempting to destroy federal evidence. There is absolutely no loyalty among corporate thieves, especially when decades of federal prison time are suddenly placed on the table. Within 48 hours, the executive team began violently tearing each other apart to secure plea deals. Leaked reports from the preliminary federal depositions described a spectacular, pathetic display of cowardice. Marcus, the man who had confidently threatened to ruin my entire tech career, immediately attempted to throw the chief executive officer and Naomi straight under the proverbial bus to save himself. He frantically claimed under oath that he was just a follower obeying executive orders, and that the fraudulent Delaware shell company was entirely Naomi's financial design. Naomi viciously retaliated by providing federal investigators with Marcus's explicit handwritten notes regarding the Cayman Island offshore kickbacks. It was a bloodthirsty, highly public spectacle as the arrogant titans of the C-suite turned into cornered rats. They turned on each other in the deposition rooms, completely destroying whatever was left of the company's reputation in a desperate, ugly bid to save their own skins. As I sat in my quiet apartment, completely detached from the blazing inferno I had ignited with a single keystroke, my phone vibrated one final time. It was a direct text message from a former colleague who was still trapped inside the lockdown building, watching the executives being marched out to the black vehicles. I opened the message and smiled at the glowing screen. It read, "They are tearing the C-suite apart looking for whoever tipped off the feds. It is a bloodbath." The final blow to the Aegis Tech empire did not happen in the chaotic corporate lobby or on the frantic Wall Street trading floors. It happened weeks later, in a deeply insulated boardroom during an emergency meeting convened by the remaining board of directors. I was naturally not present in the room, but the official transcripts later made it into the public record. A lead federal prosecutor stood before the terrified stakeholders and played a very specific audio recording. It was a tape from Marcus's official federal deposition. The prosecutor had forced Marcus to read my meticulously gathered data logs aloud, line by line, directly into the microphone. The board members sat in complete, horrified silence as they listened to their once arrogant vice president detail the exact, devastating software failures he had intentionally hidden. They heard his own voice confirm that he had knowingly pushed defective cardiac monitors, fully aware they could shut down and trigger fatal medical emergencies for the military veterans relying on them. The undeniable truth echoed off the mahogany walls. He had traded human lives for a corporate bonus. The hammer fell with absolute, crushing legal force. A federal grand jury handed down a massive 50-count indictment. Marcus and Naomi were formally charged with wire fraud, severe healthcare fraud, and malicious whistleblower retaliation. The two executives who had confidently threatened to ruin my life in that small conference room were now facing up to 30 years each in a federal penitentiary. Their careers were permanently destroyed. Their assets were completely frozen by the federal government. and their arrogant legacy was reduced to a dark cautionary tale taught in corporate ethics seminars. But the true power of knowledge is not just in its ability to destroy corruption, it is in its ability to reward absolute integrity. When I had submitted my final 400-page dossier to the federal agencies, I did not just send an anonymous tip, because the massive fraud specifically targeted a $10 million government contract. I had filed my evidence under the False Claims Act. It is a powerful piece of federal legislation that includes a provision known as qui tam. This specific law allows ordinary citizens who expose massive fraud against the federal government to sue on behalf of the taxpayers. More importantly, it legally entitles the whistleblower to a direct percentage of the recovered federal funds. 3 months after the raid, the Postal Service delivered a discreet, certified letter to my door. I opened the heavy envelope with steady hands. Inside was official correspondence from the Department of Justice, confirming my whistleblower reward. Aegis Tech had been forced to pay massive federal fines and return every single cent of the advance payments. As my legally mandated share of the recovery, the government was issuing me a staggering payout of $1.5 million. They had officially fired me for unauthorized research to save a few pennies on a severance package, and in doing so, they had inadvertently handed me an absolute fortune. The irony was exquisite. I remember sitting in the spacious, sunlit living room of my brand-new, entirely mortgage-free home, sipping a cup of high-quality dark roast coffee. I turned on the television to the financial news channel. The chief executive officer of Aegis Tech, looking incredibly sweaty and noticeably aged, was reading a heavily scripted, deeply apologetic public statement on live television, begging the remaining shareholders not to abandon the sinking ship. I watched him squirm under the hot studio lights, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, quiet peace. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from the federal agency that had handled my case. They were not calling to ask more questions. They were calling with a formal job offer. I happily accepted a high-level position as a senior investigator for a federal healthcare oversight task force. I now spend my days dismantling corrupt corporate structures and hunting down arrogant executives who think they are above the law. I am no longer the quiet, invisible woman sitting in the back of the room, buried under spreadsheets. I am the one they look for in the shadows. I am the one they should fear. Thank you so very much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and powerful, please consider helping us out. A donation of just $1 makes an incredible difference, allowing our channel to pay our hardworking staff so they can support their families and continue bringing you the very best revenge stories. You can support us by scanning the QR code right here on the screen, or by clicking the secure donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you again for your kindness, and stay strong out there.